a lot of people would generally agree with this, but the Big 12 was wide open this year. And I'm intrigued by it for a number of reasons. I think the Big 12 is always one of those conferences where there are teams that are not necessarily in the upper echelon of the top 10 or the top 15, but there's a bunch of teams within that top 25 to top 40 range that could make some noise in that region. And when I think of West Virginia, there's a number of reasons to be excited about this program. Rich Rodriguez is coming back for what will be his eighth season, his last season since 2007. He had a bunch of stops. He had a turbulent run at Michigan. Then he was at Arizona for a while, and then most recently Jacksonville State. And Jacksonville State did a phenomenal job at turning that program around, considering that they've only been in the FBS for a few seasons now. And this kind of seems like Rich Rodriguez's last opportunity to really show what he can make of it, and most importantly, kind of have a redemption story, more or less. And for everyone in Morgantown, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure, a lot of excitement, and a lot of expectation coming into the season. When I think about this West Virginia program, there are a number of different directions that you can go in. I think first and foremost, they're going to have some growing pains. I think there's no way around that. In terms of recruiting, they did take a little bit of a haircut in terms of the overall recruiting rankings. This year, they only have 12 commits compared to the past couple years where, they're more accustomed to 18 or 20. I don't necessarily think it's too foreign necessarily that they're mainly 3-star recruits. That's typically common within, the FBS ranks, particularly, kind of where West Virginia's sitting at. And it was one of those things where, back in 2019 and 2018, when Neal Brown was hired, they gave him a 6-year contract. And in 2023, hey, they went 9-4. So for them to go into 2024, there were definitely a lot more expectations that season too, especially when you think to yourself, hey, you had Garrett Green going into his senior year, somebody who I always thought was underrated and underappreciated. And, he definitely struggled with a handful of injuries, and the wide receiver room definitely wasn't up to par in terms of where they need to be. But now that we're kind of rolling into this now, there's definitely always a lot of roster turnover anytime that a coach leaves too. And quite frankly, it was one of those times where it just kind of made sense for everybody altogether, because in many ways, I think West Virginia fans were kind of sick of Neal Brown. And I think at the same time, Neal Brown kind of felt that the NIL support wasn't entirely there. And also to some degree, it probably just felt best for him to kind of move on to. But the one thing that you will give Neal Brown and Rich Rodriguez credit for, regardless of what you think about them, is that they're both phenomenal offensive minds. And, when I sit there and think about it, Neal Brown was pretty play time at his tenure at West Virginia, and Rich Rodriguez is essentially going to be doing the same thing here. And when you look at their roster, I see Jaylen Henderson transfer from Texas A&M, who should be the starter. He's young, he's athletic, he can accelerate plays outside of the pocket, and somebody who I think they're going to find some creative ways to use him. And you also have Max Brown, who was the starter at Charlotte last year, who can more or less be your insurance policy, and somebody who I think you can develop into that backup role, or somebody you can potentially bring in if there were to be some struggles there. So I do anticipate being a quarterback battle. However, I think it's pretty obvious that Jaylen Henderson should be the starter. And I think it's going to be a lot more growing pains on the offensive side of the ball. And I know that kind of sounds a little ironic considering some of West Virginia's stats last season. I mean, I sit there and look at some of these stats that I'm going to rattle off for the Mountaineers. They were 128th in yards allowed, approximately 269 yards. They were tied for 123rd in passing touchdowns, which they allowed 21, which is almost 2 a game. They were tied for 117th in interceptions with only 4. Their opponent's completion percentage was 64%, which is 108th in college football. And most importantly, I think this is a pretty alarming stat too, and I think tells the picture. 129th in opponent's passer rating, average rating of 160.8. That's an incredible stat, and quite frankly, pretty alarming, and something that I think Neal Brown's football teams have consistently had issues with. And even if you go back to to last season, the years before, there was always talks of, firing their defensive coordinator, then not entirely knowing what they were going to do. And they're at the point now where, Rich Rodriguez did bring in Zac Alley. And I'll say this right now. I think Zac Alley is going to be one of those guys we're talking about 5 years from now in terms of having a Power 5, Power 4 head coaching job. For those of you guys don't know, he got his start as defensive coordinator back in 21-22 with his first year at Jacksonville State under Rich Rodriguez. And now most recently he was at Oklahoma with Brett Venables, and Oklahoma had a really underrated defense, all things considered. So I think a lot of people within Morgantown should be excited about Zac Alley coming. And I think it's going to lead to a quicker turnaround than I think a lot of people kind of expect, because when you look at their depth chart, what really stands out to me in terms of weaknesses is that their defensive line is definitely going to be a concern. I sit there and say to myself, hey, the majority of players are going to be underclassmen that they have. And also, quite frankly, they're a little bit undersized too. So I'm definitely kind of fascinated to see how that pans out in terms of West Virginia being able to stop the run as well as, the pass as well. But at the same time too, I do think their secondary has gotten better compared to last season. They definitely have some returning guys and also some transfer guys who I think can make an immediate impact. If you look at their transfer list, the majority of the transfers that they got are following Rich Rod from Jacksonville State to Morgantown. And even if you rattle it all through, a lot of these guys were from West Virginia anyway. So you have that pipeline already built in from West Virginia. But also another area that I think Rich Rodriguez has done an excellent job at recruiting is particularly in Florida. He's had a lot of ties there, and Florida's a hotbed for a number of different recruits. So I'm definitely kind of fascinated to see where that ends up, and particularly when they play UCF later this season. I think that's going to be a game that's going to be pretty telling too, since in many ways UCF is in a similar spot with now they're bringing back Scott Frost after Gus Malzahn resigned. However, I do think that West Virginia has some more pieces to work with and a little bit more support in terms of the NIL and transfer portal too. Because now that you have Pat McAfee's name behind it, that definitely is going to help accelerate that and bring eyes to the program and everything too. But now that we're, shifting gears to the offensive side of the ball, I talked about Jaylen Henderson a little bit. I think most importantly, I'm going to be fascinated to see how balanced is this program going to be in terms of offensively. Because when I look at them offensively, there are a couple things that stand out. I'd say most importantly, the wide receiver room is going to be a problem, just like it was last year. Granted, Garrett Green had some moments of inconsistencies, had some moments of maybe getting rid of the ball quicker than he should have. However, when you look at this West Virginia team, they really didn't have that legit number one running back that they do now, and you kind of have to remind yourself too, hey, like, it's going to be tough because, Jahiem White has shown some promise that he can be that number one guy. However, he's yet to break that 1,000-yard season yet. And granted, you can make the argument that maybe he needs some more pressure on him. Maybe you can make the argument that they just simply don't run the ball enough for him to get a 1,000-yard season. However, if they really do want to kind of take that next step and be that team that does make some noise within the Big 12, they're going to have to be a more balanced program. And I don't necessarily anticipate that with Rich Rod because, for those of you who know, he primarily ran a spread offense. And especially when you look back and, the late 2000s, he even had Pat White there too. And that was such a fun time to watch as a kid too. And now, ironically enough, Pat White is the quarterback's coach and assistant to the head coach now. So it's pretty fascinating to see that kind of all come to fruition too. But as I kind of look at this team, all together, there really is no legitimate number one that I sit there and say, okay, this guy's going to be the go-to guy, or this guy's going to be the threat that these Big 12 secondaries are really going to have to look at, because they're in a tough spot for the most part. Like I said before, a lot of these guys are kind of underclassmen. A lot of these guys are undersized, and I think they're going to have to rely upon the slot receivers a lot more, being able to kind of get those big explosive plays. And most importantly, trying to find ways to make sure that this defense is not on the field nearly as much as they should be. Because quite frankly, West Virginia struggled immensely on third and fourth down last season. And when you sit there and you kind of say to yourself, hey, West Virginia ranked 47th in recruiting this year and 30th in the transfer portal, which quite frankly is pretty similar to Neal Brown. So they do have some guys coming in. They do have the anticipation and the noise and everything. But it's more or less of how they handle this pretty, tough schedule, way tougher than last year. I mean, I briefly talked about the UCF game. I do think they're in a good spot in the sense of, hey, you start off the year versus a couple patty cake games. You got Robert Morris at the beginning. You got Ohio. You have the Backyard Bowl, which very well could be a redemption game for them, considering the game that they had last year was 38-34. Lots of back and forth. And quite frankly, it was also in Pittsburgh too. So that's definitely going to be a game that is going to be marked on their calendar. So, I mean, realistically, if they can walk in being 4-0 and if they were to beat Kansas on the road, it could put them in a good spot to potentially finish anywhere from 7-5 to 9-3. Because I would say the expectation probably should be 7-5, and that's the general consensus among everybody that I've seen. But when you think of those games, but also I think this part's going to be the brutal stretch that I think a lot of people are going to have questions about. So they finish off the year. Luckily, they get Colorado at home. Then they're on the road versus Arizona State, which is always a brutal place to play, a really difficult place to play. And Kenny Dillingham's bringing back a lot of the production that they had last year. And then they have a bye, and then you finish the year versus Texas Tech, who is one of the best transfer portal classes in the entire country.